Our next speaker is David Kahane. And David is a professor in political science specializing in democrative theory and citizen involvement. He leads the Alberta Climate Dialogue Project, a 5-year community university collaboration bringing citizens together to deliberate on climate policy. He has won a number of teaching awards, including a 3M Teaching Fellowship, and he is a fruit captain for Operation Fruit Rescue, and passionately involved in the local food community in Edmonton. Dr. Kahane is going to speak to us about citizen participation in local food, building a healthier democracy.
I think I'm Mike Dido. Thank you. Can we get this? Oh, wow. I'm amplified, right? Excellent. And I have a timed slideshow which wasn't meant to be timed, so that'll be a motivation to keep going. So, yes, I'm a permaculture gardener, I'm a home butcher, I'm passionately involved in the local food scene, and I'm a prof in political science who looks at deliberative democracy, ways of structuring innovative citizen involvement. This is me and my kid and my partner in our food forest in downtown Edmonton. And so I'm going to bring those two together to really look at some of the democratic forces that have shaped food policy in interesting ways in the last couple of years. So before I go there, I just want to say perhaps some obvious things about food: intensely personal and intensely political. So on the personal side, look at any meal that you eat, and you can really, if you reflect on it, trace culture, family, memory, spirituality perhaps. All of that is alive in every meal that you eat. So it is intensely personal, often passionately connected to who we are. And if you pulled out any piece of food from that intensely personal meal, you could look in that at your relationship to others' labor, your relationships to others' exploitation perhaps, your relationship to environmental sustainability or unsustainability. And if you step back yet further, you could start to trace a whole food system for Edmonton or Alberta or Canada or globally that has to do with how food is produced, harvested, transported, sold, consumed, disposed of. I'll just say a few things from my own personal perspective about the dominant food system that we live in here in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. I think it is profoundly unsustainable. If you look at the methane emissions and GHG emissions from industrial meat production, for example, if you look at manure lagoons and their effects on the environment, profoundly unsustainable. It is unjust in many ways and unethical. If you look at who owns land, whose labor produces the food that we use, if you look at issues of the suffering of animals and the amount of animal suffering that goes into industrial meat production, and it is profoundly unhealthy, which Dr. Sharma will speak about later in terms of obesity, but we could also talk about antibiotic-resistant superbugs and so on, and how that relates to meat production. So, against that background, let me talk about some things that have been stirring in Edmonton. Two big things happened last year in Edmonton around food. You may already know of these. One was the area structure plan for the northeast farmlands in Edmonton. So City Council decided at the end of last year that some of the richest farmland in Alberta, which had been bought speculatively by large North American property developers, would in fact be allowed to be developed into a technology park and suburbs. There was a big struggle over that I'm going to talk about a bit. The other thing that happened was the passage of FRESH, this urban agriculture and food policy that is now a strategy in the city of Edmonton, and things are flowing from this. There was a very interesting democratic politics around each of these. Part of that politics has to do with this bottom-up claiming of social space and political space for food passions, food innovation. This is a picture of students at Jasper Park High School reclaiming their school grounds and turning it into a permaculture food forest. You could also talk about fruit rescue, which I'm involved in. You could talk about organic farming, farm dinners, farmers market. There's just such a burgeoning of people taking their passions, taking their desire for relationship, their desire for community, their desire for DIY food skills, and creating something new. So they're claiming space for this. Another kind of claiming of space is more overtly political. So this is a picture of Riverbend Farm, which is in those northeast farmlands, now threatened by the Northeast Area Structure Plan, the Horse Hill Area Structure Plan. This became a political issue in Edmonton because of the very deliberate political work of an organization called the Greater Edmonton Alliance, or GEA. GEA is a coalition of churches, social justice organizations, other civic organizations that have this quite distinctive way of building campaigns. They went out in 2009 in one iteration of this, and you'll just have to excuse my backing up from time to time, had house meetings in ordinary people's homes and asked the question, what is impinging on your life? What is important to you in your life? Just ordinary conversations about ordinary people's lives with a particular emphasis on the lives of the marginalized. And out of those conversations came a thread that had to do with food scarcity, food vulnerability, food resilience. And out of those conversations came a campaign that included preserving fertile agricultural land within the boundaries of Edmonton for farming, and a whole analysis of why that was important. They managed to pack City Hall at a crucial moment with 500 ordinary citizens who cared about this. If you've ever sat in City Hall during a council meeting, 500 is a lot. It's usually about 12 and a half. So this made an impression on councillors, and though we are a very development-friendly city, the councillors agreed that no development would go forward in Horse Hill until we had a citywide food and agriculture strategy that could inform this area structure plan. So a triumph of this bottom-up, claimed space political organizing. The city did a very interesting thing when they decided to develop this food and agriculture strategy, and they were doing it under a lot of time pressure because developers wanted certainty and hopefully success in the ability to develop these Northeast lands. But even with the clock ticking, they decided that not only would they consult stakeholders, powerful stakeholders in the way they usually do, not only would they hire consultants and get expert opinion, not only would they hear from their civil service, but they would bring together ordinary citizens in a set of citizen panels to really try and get a reading on what Edmontonians want their food system to look like, food and agriculture strategy in the city to look like. So this is really a very interesting process. This is the kind of citizen involvement that I study. It was well done. So they brought together 66 demographically representative Edmontonians, the city in a room if you like, gave them good information. They met for 6 half days, learned a lot about the food system, wrestled with trade-offs, and ultimately voted on recommendations to City Council. Their top recommendation, I'll need to read it to you, was create and or amend zoning, bylaws, fees, and taxes to prohibit developments on good fertile agricultural land, particularly the Northeast farmlands. So, that didn't work. That was not, in fact, what the city chose to do, and I want to talk about some lessons that are there in the failure of the citizens panel to actually make a difference in this crucial decision that was the object of their highest recommendation. So I'll just mention 4 things that I think need to be the case with these innovative forms of citizen involvement to really cut ice in complex policy settings. One giant question for these processes is, who do they make their recommendations to? And I think in the strongest, most democratic cases, what happens is a citizens panel, a citizens assembly, a citizens council is able to make its recommendations to the decision makers with a great deal of publicity, a great deal of accountability, so that it's not required of the decision makers that they do what's recommended, but they have to do a whole lot of explaining if they don't. This was not the case with the food and ag panels. In fact, they made their recommendations to an advisory committee for the food and ag policy that was handpicked by the mayor, by many accounts quite divided, if not dysfunctional. The citizen panel recommendations parachuted into that advisory committee's work at a very late stage. They had no particular instructions about how to incorporate it, and many of the recommendations are only palely reflected in Fresh, the urban ag strategy that was passed by a narrow majority in that advisory committee. So I think that one thing you want to look for in these processes is, do they report publicly with a strong requirement of accountability to the decision makers themselves? Secondly, there are many different inputs into complex policy processes, right? There are experts, consultants, civil servants, and in these cases, citizens. How do those inputs fit together? Often they're all just kind of lobbed into the black box of decision making, and someone with power reaches in and pulls out what they need. But there's very little systematic, principled explanation of how these inputs will be weighed against each other. I would say that in the strongest cases, what you want is for many of these inputs to actually filter through a well-done citizens process, so that the citizens are saying, we understand what the development industry is saying, we understand what the farmers are saying, we understand what's coming from all these different directions, including expert input. Here, as citizens, is where we want it to go. Thirdly, you do need time. This whole process was very compressed. I think it was about a 10-month process. And the citizen participation part, the invited space of citizen participation, was compressed to 6 weeks. I think that the strongest versions of these citizen processes weave citizen input in throughout a policy process and can really give the citizens many points of influence in how it's framed, in what's recommended, and so on. And then fourthly, lastly, I would say, in the words of John Gaventa, a well-known theorist of power and of citizen participation, you need to be able to work both sides of the equation. On one side of the equation are invited spaces of citizen participation, where an ally within government or a government says, we want the citizen voice. We're creating a space for it. And there are many interesting models for how to do that. And on the other hand are claimed spaces, the kind of decentralized grassroots activity that we see in food organizing in Edmonton, and the more manifestly political mobilization that we saw in Gia's work. Gaventa's study, he did a meta-study of citizen participation in 14 countries and said the places where you really got pro-poor outcomes, which is what they were looking at in that case, are the places where both of these were strong. In fact, in the development of FRESH and the development of the area structure plan, there were invited spaces and claimed spaces. There were all of these citizens who showed up at City Hall, which is just to say that there are a lot of obstacles to political change when it comes to food systems. There are no silver bullets, and we need to keep on organizing and holding feet to the fire. One thing I would point to is the Food Council that came out of the development of FRESH. A lot of very white faces, but it's actually a quite diverse committee in some other ways. There's some very interesting voices on that council, including Dustin Beyer, who is doing the Jasper Park Permaculture Project. I actually hope for some good things from this council. I think there are things they're not doing well in terms of communicating out and staying connected to these vibrant food communities. But watch for what they recommend, and also watch for whether anyone pays attention to what they recommend. Where I'm going to put my money in terms of many of my own energies, political and otherwise, will be with this vibrant, bottom-up, passionate engagement in many different dimensions of food organizing that we find in Edmonton. And in my last couple of minutes, I just wanted to offer you a little diagram. You'll be amazed by my graphic skills, that offers one explanation of why this kind of informal organizing might be enough. This comes from Meg Wheatley and the work of the Kahane Institute, where she observes that in big processes of social change, in many different domains, and I see this as true of the food system, there is an existing system or a dominant system that is unsustainable and dying. And I think it's clear that our food system, with industrial scale, farming, meat production, all of its environmental effects, all of its justice effects, is dying. And so our job there is to hospice the existing system, to have some compassion toward those whose work is there, whose life projects are there, but basically to help it to die with as little damage caused as possible. And that meanwhile, we have to pioneer new practices, network around those practices, nourish those practices. I really see that as happening in Edmonton. I see that as happening out of this diverse local food, healthy food, etc., burgeoning of organizations and activities. And in a sense, we create an alternative system within the existing system, so that when finally greater numbers of people start to recognize that the dominant system cannot continue, there's a live, vibrant, magnetic alternative that people can step to. And so I see that as the political work that is being done, even by things as benign as bread baking workshops, or canning workshops, or spin gardening, or permaculture gardening. This is my food forest. I spend a lot of time there when it's not quite this cold. And I guess in closing, I would just urge you to find that aspect of your own food practices that you could get more involved in, cooking for others, cooking with others, being curious about where your food comes from, and meeting some of the people who might be producing it. I don't think this needs to be an agenda of guilt. Feel bad about where your food comes from and change your practices because you feel bad. I think the power of this movement is that it comes actually from desire, from passion, and from all of the social interconnection and actual political capacity and interconnection that arises from that passion and that desire. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, questions, please. And again, if you would like to raise your hand, the mics will come to you.